Hello, this is Father Hightower, and welcome to Vox SFX, the voice of St. Francis Xavier Parish in Missoula, Montana. We are so pleased that you have joined us. Your participation enriches our entire community. We hope that our show serves as a point of light, helping to deepen our understanding and experience of the Catholic faith and history. So join us as we seek through prayer, study, interviews, and discussion the roots of the practice of our faith. God bless.
Hello, and welcome to Vox SFX, the voice of St. Francis Xavier Parish in Missoula, Montana. We're so very pleased that you could be with us today. Today's episode is the first of our three-part Advent series, where we look into some of the things that make this time of year particularly special to us as people, as Catholics, as Christians. This first episode is on that of sacred art. We've all seen sacred art. We've all heard its praises sung. It hangs in museum galleries and over our kitchen tables. It is something that they talk about in schools all over the world. Sacred art is something that can be universally appreciated by people who are either of faith or perhaps not. There is something to be shared in the glimpsing of emotion in such a way that words cannot convey. Art speaks where words fail. And when we look at sacred art, we are able to glimpse at the very heart of the divine. We are able to feel emotions and display things that convey deep messages. These types of art range all over the place, from paintings to sculpture to mosaics to the simple drawing of children during Sunday school. Father Lankenau is on our episode today to talk about the historic significance of sacred art and some of its deep ties to the very identity of our church. This will further help us appreciate what this art truly means to this season, to our church, to ourselves, and to the history of the very world. So please, sit back and enjoy as we speak with Father Lankenau about sacred art. With us in the studio today is Father Tom Lankenau. Welcome, Father.
It's good to be here. Thank you for having me and allowing me to share something that I'm very passionate about. First, a little background about myself. Currently, I'm the sacramental minister at St. John the Baptist in Frenchtown, and they have two missions, one in Alberton and the other one in Superior. Prior to coming here, I did some parish work in Missoula and Hamilton. I was a university chaplain in Boise, taught high school in Spokane. Academically, I was a wildlife biologist, taught high school, lived around a lot of places, so I think all of this has kind of colored my insights to the way I understand the world and the way I look at it.
Sure. Well, I know that Western Montana has certainly colored my world as well. So today we're going to be talking about sacred art, which is something that is fundamental to the soul of Catholicism. Do you want to give us a brief overview as to why that's important before we dive right in?
Well, part of it has to do with it's as old as the tradition itself. You know, you go to the catacombs in Rome and you see in the burial chambers, cubiculum, you'll see art. You see frescoes of Jesus, the Good Shepherd. You see some of the gospel stories, Jesus healing a woman afflicted with hemorrhaging. So you start to gain insights into what did the faithful feel was important during that time. How did they understand Christ? How did they understand some of the doctrines of the church? And then as you progress over the centuries and even millennium, you kind of see an evolution of sacred art that says, okay, we have Jesus as a young man, bearded, and then, around the 6th century, he starts to take on have a beard. He's up in the tops of churches, and then we get into the Middle Ages, late Middle Ages, and not only do we see more emphasis on biblical stories like theater, but we also heavy emphasis on the passion of Christ, the suffering, and then, of course, the explosion of art about Mary in the Renaissance and the Baroque period. So it's kind of like our own faith. We deepen our understanding of it through our experience with it, through our engagement of it, and then art helps us to kind of articulate that. I mean, I think the greatest example is in the Counter-Reformation, or the Catholic Reformation after the Council of Trent in the 16th century. There's an explosion of art that relates to the core doctrines of the church that came out of the Council of Trent. Well, you're in a culture where people couldn't read. They had no access to books. How do you articulate the real presence of Christ? How do you articulate what it means to receive the sacrament of penance, or even things like extreme unction? Well, bring in the artists. And they could help articulate what people knew in their heart, but they couldn't, necessarily say it. Liz Lev is a great art historian. She wrote a book called How Catholic Art Saved the Faith. And I think that's something we have to pay attention to. She didn't say it was fish fries or bingo, or another document. It's just it was art that saved the faith. And there's a number of great theologians today, bishops, somebody like Bishop Robert Barron. You'll see publications, and they all have art on them. So it's sort of a resurgence of the importance that art plays in our faith. And it's a treasure of the church. You go to any great museum around the world, and they will have sacred art paintings in them. So it's also a way to engage other cultures, particularly the culture of the unchurched, non-Christian cultures. I know when the Jesuits went to South America, and again, how do you catechize? How do you tell somebody who Jesus is or who Mary is? And they have no concept of it, but you show them a picture, and pretty soon they're going to say, who is that person, and why are they doing that? And so it captures sort of our own curiosity, too.
And it's not necessarily just depictions of Christ or the Holy Family. We also have a lot of depictions of the saints, too.
Exactly. And again, role models. You started seeing in the 13th century, late 13th century, immediately paintings of St. Francis of Assisi, receiving the stigmata, preaching to the animals, embracing the cross. After a while, if you could mass produce these, this is what people were putting on in their homes. There was already a cult of the saints. People would go on pilgrimages, and they would want to see where the burial place of the saint was, or perhaps the house. And then art kind of reinforced that. I mean, as a great example is Caravaggio's The Madonna of Loreto, which is in St. Agostino in Rome. Well, it was already part of the pilgrimage. And what Caravaggio is capturing is kind of the humility of the pilgrim. They're not knowing what they're going to encounter. They just know they want to journey. And Mary appears to an elderly couple. They're poor, they're commoners, and it's like Mary is taking time to come to anyone. She's presenting Jesus. It's a wonderful image. As with the saints, it's a sense of the accessibility. If Christ is up in the heavens or can sometimes feel too far away, Mary is near, the saints are near. And that draws people, I think, more deeply into their faith, the confidence that wherever they are, God is with them.
And it allows us to emote with our faith as well, because, for instance, it's hard to look at the Pietà and not feel your heart breaking because of how well it's been made, or it's hard not to, when you're looking up at the ceiling at our parish in St. Francis Xavier, to feel awe and wonder at not just the Father and the Son, but also the splendor of Mary. And so, like you said, art is a way of conveying that. There's one thing for us to say, yes, God lives in heaven in splendor. It's another thing to see it depicted.
Here's a great example. You mentioned the Pietà, of course, which is a masterpiece. Michelangelo's 25 years old. And I like to kid college students, what are you going to do at 25? Who are you going to work for? During the late Middle Ages and certainly in the Renaissance and the Baroque, the greatest artists, greatest architects, the greatest artisans all worked for the church. It was a way to express those God-given talents. It was a way to certainly make a lot of money, but it was a way to kind of connect people to, like you said, the things in our heart that we can't always articulate. So the Pietà, certainly, here's Mary's flowing dress that's images or echoes of a humeral veil. It's a Eucharistic piece. And here's Jesus's hand coming down, almost like pointing to the altar, pointing to the Eucharist. I mean, it's just wonderful to look at a piece of art and then be drawn into the symbolism and then the meaning of it. And you never can plumb the depths of it. I remember the first time I saw the Pietà in 1995, I walked into St. Peter's, looked to the right, and there it was, and I almost fell over. It was just that incredible. But then there's also paintings that you go to over and over and over again. There's one called The Repentant Magdalene by Georges de la Tour, and that's in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., and every time I go to D.C., I make sure I go to see the National Gallery, but then I'll go to that room and I'll just sit in front of that painting. And because it's about reconciliation, about being repentant, but also receiving Christ's grace, forgiveness. And it's about knowing our own mortality, and reflecting on that. But you're right about awe. And you're right about beauty, that you can't describe it. You just know when you're in the presence of it.
You had mentioned that there was an explosion of art, of Catholic art, following the Protestant Reformation and our kind of Reformation as well. Why was that? Why wasn't there that prevalence of art beforehand? And why was there such a prevalence of art afterwards?
A little bit of the context. First of all, art's expensive, all right? Most of the churches at that time were run by monastic orders, particularly Benedictines, Dominicans. So, you had more control over that. You didn't have this patronage system of a wealthy cardinal or an archbishop or even the emperor. So that was part of it. And then two is it really wasn't until about the 13th century when you had somebody like it'll come to me, but he starts working for the Franciscans, and he's doing the images of St. Francis. And so, like today, somebody says, that's cool, it's popular, I want to copy that, I want to do that. So that's a little bit of that. You had some large churches, but the Gothic churches of France, the art there was the stained glass windows, and you had some southern Europe, Italy, Spain, you had the frescoes on the walls and the ceilings. But certainly the early church, you had the history of mosaics, icons. So it was there. It was just part of the church itself. It wasn't commissions by wealthy people to put it in their homes, or make it more accessible to the general public. Those fed on each other. But also, I think Catholics had the art. So after the Reformation, it's like two opposing teams. They have to identify themselves, wear their own uniforms. So some of the reformers took out the art in the churches.
Some of them were even iconoclasts.
They were. They destroyed saints, ripped down pictures and whatnot. All right, well, the Catholic Church has to say, well, what do we stand for? We stand for beauty. We stand for art as a media, as an entryway into the divine. It's part of who we are. There was always, concern about the second commandment, graven images and whatnot. And the church had already gone through the iconoclastic age in the 800s or so. But now they're saying, no, we need the artists. We need them to articulate the faith and to help people embrace the faith. That was so key then, and I think it's now. You talk to somebody on the street and say, what do you know about Moses? And they say, Moses who? what can you tell me about the real presence of the Eucharist? And they look at us like we're talking a foreign language. But if you showed them a beautiful painting, the forgiveness of Jesus, show them the prodigal son, and they immediately get it.
And when we're talking about getting it, that early spread of Christianity, that very rapid spread of Christianity around the Mediterranean, as you said, that it wasn't the depiction of Jesus that we are familiar with, because now we look up and we see the bearded man with the long, rather straight-looking hair. But you had said that that it was a much younger Jesus at the time, who was clean-shaven and had these curly locks. When did that transition occur, and why?
You think about the first 3 centuries of Christianity, localized Jerusalem, Antioch, and often persecuted, often underground, and still very new. And if you're new, what do? You look at the surrounding culture, look at where you came from. And so you had these Roman images of a shepherd. It was part of their own lore. The taking care of the flock is representative of taking care of the people. So those were already there. Well, same thing with church design. You just adapt a Roman building and you make it a church. We did that with the Pantheon in Rome, but you look at some of the early papal basilicas, they were no different than a Roman meeting place, So you didn't have steeples and cupolas and stained glass windows and all of that. And that makes sense. So the first few centuries until Christianity was legalized in the early 4th century, your art's going to be fairly conservative, fairly simple. It didn't have the techniques, but it also had echoes of its dominant culture. And then after not only Christianity legalized, but just this explosion of churches, explosion of missionary activity to Central Europe, and the influence of Byzantine art styles on the faith, and that's when you start to see a more mature Christ. You see the development of icons, which means window. It's a window into the divine. And you had this duality on an icon, the younger Christ and then the older Christ, the wisdom figure. So not only were they accessible for prayer, but now people started to get a different image of understanding who Christ was. Well, continued reflection, and then you start to see Christ on the cross. That didn't come around until 7th, 8th century and even later. That is like, well, who is Jesus? Well, he died for our sins. He suffered for us. He saved all humanity. Okay, how do we depict that? And you show the crucifixion. And then, of course, you go into the Baroque period, and then the more drama you can get, the better, bloodshed and close-ups and all this other stuff. But it worked. I think that's part of it. Is the art we see today? It's because it worked.
Right.
Yeah.
I went through those transitions, much like the churches themselves, because when we look at the old churches, they're done in that Romanesque style. Everything is smooth. You've got those rounded, very kind of calm-looking things. And then we transition into the Gothic period, where everything is very stark. You've got these flying buttresses that come out in a dramatic fashion, these high steeples, very kind of pointy and rigid. Why did that transition occur? Is it around the same time that they transitioned the look of Christ as well? No.
The Gothic starts in the 11th century. Like anything else, architects see what somebody else does and say, well, I can do this better. So you have the transition from the Roman-looking church, which was like an auditorium. If you go to St. Mary Major's or St. Paul Beyond the Walls, St. John Lateran in Rome, massive spaces, but they were flat-ceilinged. You could put 5,000 people in them, and you can imagine somebody talking. There were groups gathered. Well, it's not until, again, the influence of Byzantine architecture, the dome. You think of Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, and somebody said, wow. And then you make the dome symbolic. It's the birthing of the church, it's the womb and all the rest of that. Well, same thing with spires, same things with verticality. Well, you didn't have the architectural understanding how to make a church tall. That massive weight would crush. The ceiling would fall in on itself. So it wasn't until, and I don't know the exact origins of Gothic, but you can see this sense of verticality. It almost becomes like envy. Our church is taller than yours, and that's what you have in the 12th and 13th century, was this explosion of envy, you might call, or hubris. We have a taller church. We have a bigger church. We have more bones of saints than you do. We have Mary's veil, whatever it is. And of course, so it was connected to pilgrimages. It was connected to civic pride. Think of the stadiums today as a good example. You track the evolution of stadiums. We went from a simple venue where you just watched the game to more and more elaborate, electronic, and all these other things, domes. And we went through periods where certain stadium design is no longer around. That multi-purpose football, baseball stadium, those are all gone. Now it's single-purpose, massive buildings, and you get this envy. Look what we can do. It's all about, razzmatazz. And then out comes a whole new way of understanding what a stadium is. And I think the same thing happened in the churches. You had influences. You had the Norman influence in Brittany and England, and then you had the Gothic influence. But then you go down to Italy and Spain, and especially Spain, you have the Moorish influence of architecture. So I find it fascinating. That's the beauty of traveling worldwide. You start to see how the church is understood, portrayed. I was in Indonesia, and I saw in 1 week, we have an island, Bali has a lot of Hindus on it, and then you go over to Java, and that's the Buddhist, and you went from a church that had a remnants of looking like a Hindu temple, and you go over to Java, and there the church had a Jesus who looked like a more like a Javan person. And then same thing, seeing them in Africa. So there's always an interplay of the environment, the culture. I remember seeing a church in Hawaii, no windows. You just let the air in. I think that's what's fun, and especially for young people who want to go into architecture, and to say, we're not done building churches. And the same thing with art. We're not done trying to depict who Jesus is. I mean, you speak of architecture, I think of Sagrada Familia, Gaudi's masterpiece still being constructed in Barcelona, and you talked about the verticality of Gothic. Well, he goes one step further, and he makes those pillars look like trees. So where you have the secular world where people say, my cathedral is a forest. Well, Gaudi understood that. And now you're not only in a forest, but you understand the beauty of trees, and then the immensity, and they're supporting that ceiling. And, I mean, there's just such an amazing interplay of understanding of architecture, but the theology, and then I think just basic human desires for being in beautiful spaces.
But there needs to be a balance, of course, because all of this art, all of these beautiful churches, they do cost money. And one could argue that part of the reason for the Reformation starting was because there were so many churches, cathedrals being built at that time by the popes trying to build up that clout, if you will, and the taxes and the kind of tithing that was put onto the people, particularly in Germany, kind of fed more of those political tensions. There were religious justifications, but political tensions were huge there. How do we balance that? How do we make sure that we're inspiring awe and beauty into our people without trying to take advantage?
I think that's a good insight. Well, first of all, again, you go back to the best and brightest working for the church. They themselves were men and women of belief. And it was almost a gift to the church. And it was a recognition, too, of that lasting recognition. Michelangelo chisels his name on the Pietà. It's kind of hard not to know who the sculptor was. Was it expensive relative today? No, because first of all, you had the materials right there. Marble was commonly used. Stone was commonly used. You had stonemasons. So today, if you tried to build a new St. Peter's, you'd be in the billions of dollars. I mean, it certainly wasn't cheap back then. People say, well, they could be feeding the poor, all right, or building St. Peter's. And it's like, well, why can't you do both? The sense of glorifying God through the material world, through the handiwork of man. whether it's architecture, music, whether it's, in the paintings and sculptures and whatnot, and at the same time doing great works. The other part that most people don't realize is during the Middle Ages, that cathedral was the center of town. It's where you had all of the feast days, you had the gatherings, you had public announcements. I mean, there's a reason why Luther put the 99 Theses on the Wittenberg Cathedral, because people would have read them. The church served a different function than it is today. And also, it was a way to increase the economy of a city, because you now could hold festivals. People would visit on pilgrimages, and they would come and they would need food and housing and all the rest of that stuff. So it was part and parcel of the local economy. You could probably even argue that it would be like a capital expenditure for, a civic building that actually increased commerce.
Ultimately, in most cases, in most places, it was an extremely beneficial thing to have that kind of construction going on in any given city.
Oh, definitely. I mean, you're also talking 50, 100, 200 years that it took to build. The chapter ran out of money. Well, it just stood there, and then they, waited until they got some more and rebuilt it. But I like that approach. It's long term, and the church has always had a long-term vision. They see things differently. So the fact that Gaudi started Sagrada Familia in the early 1900s, and we're still 5 years away from construction, it's okay. It reminds us of the sort of that ongoing work of God, and then the vision of somebody, then how we can keep that. You might even say the vision of the early church fathers, the vision of the councils. How do we keep that alive?
I want to double back real quick to when we were talking about materials, and not necessarily for the materials of building the building itself, but sometimes for the art itself, because some of the more famous pieces or some of the more famous places that we can visit as Catholics have a lot of bones. Where those bones are built into the walls as like pillars. One might say morbid ossuary, but when did that start, and why? Where is that particular medium used?
Well, a good example is the Capuchin Church in Rome by the train station, but it has a crypt there. All right, so you bury the monks there, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, and then some of the locals will say, well, I want to be buried there. If you think about it, all churches all had a cemetery attached to them, the nearness of the holy place of the church, and then you have to gradually do something with those bones. You think about it, ossuaries were common. Even at the time of Jesus, you'd have a tomb, and maybe 2 or 3 years later, you would remove the bones, and you could put all the bones in a box. And then you might keep those even in homes or have a special shrine for them or whatnot. So that's already done in so many cultures that, so you have in the crypt of the Franciscan Church, you have monks in decay, and they're, held up and whatnot. That's the morbidity I think you talk about. But then you have thousands upon thousands over centuries and centuries of these bones. And somebody, I don't know who or how, decided to make it ornate, and they started decorating the ceilings with the bones and entryways. And I remember there were 2 hands crossed, and then in front of it was a small skull. And part of it's a reminder of our own mortality. Sure. There's no doubt you can't be cognizant of that. And then even to take something as human and as real as a bone and make it a work of art. I know there's one, I think, in Croatia. They've done a chandelier out of bones. Some people might find that gruesome, and others might say, well, it's a reminder of our own mortality, and it helps us to reflect, to think. I mean, the creativity of humans. We've always taken something from nature, and we can make musical instruments out of it. We can make building materials. Artists would make pigments from it. They take different clay, and you get different pigments. Or you take a rock, and you've got that. So,
Mummy yellow.
Yeah, that's right. I think that would take an anthropologist and a historian to kind of discuss that, the exact evolution of it. But you can't deny that it's certainly a memory when you go see those.
But it's very striking, like you say, and in some cases it wasn't necessarily just the honored dead who were being displayed in this way, but we also had several instances of martyrs being honored in this way as well.
Oh yeah. Now, I find the cult of saints, though, not only a little ghoulish, but almost too extreme. You have saints being buried and people were robbing their graves and they're cutting up their bones. And now I get that. You couldn't go to the Holy Land because it was off limits, the dangers, the expense of travel. So bring the saints to you. So the idea is good. But then you get the craziness of, well, especially with Mary or Jesus, Mary's milk or Mary's veil or whatever it is, And you had, 3 heads of John the Baptist and on and on and on. And you think, really? But I remember talking about relics with my high school students. I said, think about it. There's a concert and the guy, Elvis, throws his scarf out. Well, the next day, there's 500 of them on eBay. Everybody claims to have it. Everybody's selling part of it, or Barry Bonds' home run ball or whatever. So you get that in both in the secular world as well as the sacred world. But I think the beauty of places of pilgrimages and appropriate done relics is it does connect you to the life of the saint. It draws you into that sense of holiness. And we need that. We need more places of pilgrimage. You think about in the U.S. compared to, say, Europe. Do we really have many places of pilgrimages? People may say, well, I'm going to go to New York City as a graduation gift. But more often than not, what do people say? I'm going to Disneyland. And I'm sorry, but I just vomit when I hear that. It's like the pinnacle of a pilgrimage. I tell parents, I say, when your child graduates from 8th grade, what a great opportunity to go to Washington, D.C., see the monuments, and then, or New York City, a great city, great culture, wherever you pick that. And then when they graduate from college, that's the time to take them to Europe. To expand their horizons, because oftentimes in college they may have a chance to travel, and then you're teaching them values, the value of the beauty of buildings and art and architecture and culture. But back to the saints, so it did get a little crazy. But even to this day, though, and if I'm traveling and somebody said, oh, this is where Saint so-and-so is buried, I said, well, I'm going to go visit that. It's a great place to have a prayer. And kind of reflect on who that person's life is. Sometimes it's totally surprising. I was in Cologne, Germany, and I'm just walking through the area downtown, and there's a church, and I'm Franciscan church, because I always like to make visits and see what's there. And there's the tomb of Duns Scotus, great philosopher. And I thought, well, that was kind of a pleasant surprise, Yeah.
And you had mentioned places of pilgrimage, and I know that the United States has been kind of a consumerist culture for quite a while, but we also don't have the steepled history, the age that Europe did. But if you were to suggest any pilgrimages here in the United States, what would you think would be a good place?
I think that's a really good question. I mean, one that it would invite dialogue from a lot of folks. There's a couple Marian shrines. There's one in Wisconsin. I could tell everybody it's Our Lady of Champion. I said it's Our Lady of the Cheesehead. Certainly cathedrals. You could go along the East Coast and do historical churches and see some spectacular ones in several days. Montana is another one. I would do a pilgrimage to some of the pioneer churches. You look at some of our smaller towns, Hamilton, Frenchtown. I remember I've seen a couple in the central part of the state. Beautiful churches. And it represents, it's no different than a cathedral in France. It's the sweat and blood and the sacrifice of the faithful on a different scale. But that's what's so great, and they're accessible. Beautiful, beautiful places. And then, of course, Helena. You go to Helena and you think, okay, I'm in a time warp. I'm now in Gothic France, And then I tell everybody at St. Francis Xavier here in Missoula, I say, this is the Sistine Chapel of the West. you enter and say, okay, I made a wrong turn and ended up in Italy. So it can be done. Obviously, the missions in California, I've done those. But I think part of it is what excites you? What are you interested in? Age level and all those other things. But you could even do a pilgrimage of American saints, people who were considered heroes, martyrs. I was thinking of Father Capuan in Wichita, who was a POW in Korea. His canonization process is going on. Stanley Rother is in Oklahoma, and some of them, whether or not their tombs are there or just a reminder this is their birthplace. But there are enough great American men and women that I think you can start to develop that sense. I mean, we go to Elvis's birthplace and whatever else, it's like, I think we can do the same thing for the holy men and women in our own heritage.
And last night, we were at a Knights of Columbus meeting together, and you were talking about the oldest church in the United States, which I believe you said was in
Santa Fe and also St. Augustine. So, but the oldest community was St. Augustine, but Santa Fe is the second. But the cathedral there dates back, 1620s, no, even earlier, late 1500s. Oh yeah, you could do historical ones. You could, you can go across the South where there were not many Catholics at all, and you get a sense of what it means to proclaim your faith in a non-Catholic or anti-Catholic area. Sure. So yeah, you could do some of those. I remember even going to San Antonio, went to Mass at one of the missions. People forget that the Alamo was a mission. And then to go there, and here's a mariachi band at Mass. It was really cool. I have often thought a great pilgrimage would be the various festivals. So you have San Gennaro in New York, and I was in north part of Boston, and they have their own Italian feast, and you could go around the country. I was in Guadalupe, Arizona, which is right outside of Phoenix, for Good Friday. And you had the Native American culture as they understood it, and their sort of like their passion play. It was beautiful, and you could find that all around the U.S. I think those festivals, that's a way of also entering into not only the history of our faith, but the diversity and the multiple ways that it's celebrated and lived.
And you had mentioned the fact that, again, this is a widespread thing. This expression of art is fundamentally Catholic. But when you go from place to place, the face of Jesus changes. If you're looking at depictions of Christ in the Coptic church, he's extremely dark-skinned. If you start to look at pictures from Northern Europe and America, we start to see a man with pale skin and more straight-looking hair. And then if you look in kind of the Mediterranean area, you see maybe a more accurate depiction of him as a first-century Palestinian Jew. Why do we do that? Why do we change the face of Jesus where we go?
Well, I think you want to look at your heroes as an extension of yourself, your culture. So he's going to take on the clothing, your looks. It's very interesting in art. That's a good point. If you want to know something about the culture and the history, you look at the art, and then you also get an insight, okay, who's that painting for? Is everybody in the painting, like in a Botticelli painting, they all look fabulously beautiful, beautiful clothing? Then you start to get a sense of that painting didn't go into a church necessarily, went on somebody's wall in their living room, So, but it's a reflection of your own culture. So I remember going to the Church of Little Flower in Browning, Montana. Oh, I think it's one of the most beautiful churches for a small town. It's stone. It's a Native American Jesus on the cross, and then the stained glass windows are the stations of the cross. And again, it's a Native American Jesus. It's just beautiful. It fits in that context. Another great church, a good example, the Chapel of the Holy Cross in Sedona, Arizona, Frank Lloyd Wright. And you have this incredible, simple building built out of the rocks. And it's a place for anybody to go. But you recognize I'm in a Catholic chapel, Okay, so it's a place of welcome. We focus so much on getting people to Mass, we forget about let's get them first into our churches. Let's build our churches so that it says, come on in, this is beautiful. That's the one thing that the churches have over all these stadiums or Disneyland. They're free, and if we make them places of beauty and prayer and reverence, people will come into them. I spent a month last year traveling through France and then a little bit of London and Ireland, looking at churches and what's common. And because again, you talked about all these big, beautiful churches, and they're empty. And yet some are not empty. Some are active and vibrant. But to start to realize that when you have something for people to do inside a church, light a candle, offer prayer, all of a sudden you get more and more people in there. Or you have somebody welcoming people. But if they go in and it looks like a storage room, or there's just more junk there, it looks more like the bulletin board and a laundromat. So that's not welcoming. Or I would show pictures from the outside. You couldn't find the entryway. The place was fenced. There were people sleeping in the doorways. That's not welcoming either. And I think that's what we almost need to recapture that. Sure, the Mass is the central focus of the church, but first you got to get people inside. And how do you do that? Make it beautiful on the outside. Make it inviting. Remember Sacré-Cœur, built in the 1800s, okay? High point of Montmartre in France. 5 million visitors a year, okay? And then there's a sign that says welcome, and then it says for 135 years, continuous prayer, 24-hour-a-day adoration. And this in a culture that's becoming more and more secular, anti-church, and yet they're saying, look at us.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the Sacré-Cœur. I was in France about 5 years ago, and it was for the Jubilee.
Yeah.
And so we went up to see Sacré-Cœur, but it was just packed. I mean, you couldn't have gotten in if you waited for a year, because there was just so many people. But there was this beautiful little chapel off to the side. I don't remember the name of it, but it was very simple. It was made of, it looked like clay. But inside there were the most intimate and, in my opinion, meaningful depictions. I saw a depiction of Mary in there, and I was compelled to fall to my knees and weep. So simple, but so beautiful and so striking. So sometimes even these massive displays of beauty and art, they're amazing, but also there's that simplicity that can speak to our souls as well.
You're right, and that's why when I travel, I try to find out what's in that area and whatnot. I remember the Sanctuary de Chimayo in New Mexico, not outside of Santa Fe, and you're exactly right. It's a simple adobe church. In fact, a good wind might push it over, and yet you go inside and you recognize this is different. It's they have the holy dirt there. People make pilgrimages to it. The walls are lined with crutches, or little pictures of their loved ones or whatever. And you're entering into a different realm of understanding our faith, a trust in God, the idea that God is active healing in our lives. We need places like that as much as we need the Shrine of the Basilica of the Immaculate Conception. It's not an either or. And I remember, then you go to the place like the Air Force Academy. Mm-hmm. All right. And to say we took airplane wings, and that's what we did as the frame for that chapel. It's like, okay.
That is a stunning chapel.
It is,
too.
And I start to think about places that I visited. You go to middle of Kansas, and there's this massive, Gothic church there, and you can see it for miles around. It's like, we need all of those tiny country chapels to the magnificent basilicas.
Well, and as you mentioned, it's what draws people in.
Mm-hmm.
I had a buddy come over the other day because I was having an issue in my studio, and he's an extremely smart guy when it comes to that. But I had him over, and I thought, maybe, because I've been trying to kind of get him to come to church. I've been trying to get him to maybe think about it. And so, but he's been kind of resisting. He's like, yeah. But I brought him over to the sanctuary. And as we walked in, I watched his jaw drop, and he just went, wow. And in that moment, I was like, he might be considering it, because it like you said, it drew him in. It made it a part of the experience. It wasn't just bare walls. It was an expression.
So here's a good insight about bare walls. It's a little facetious, but it's also, I think, part of what you're speaking of. So I got to Hamilton, St. Francis of Assisi, which is a very, very pretty, pioneer church, inside, outside. Well, they have this really nice parish center next door, and it's used by a lot of secular groups, funeral luncheons, wedding receptions, whatever. Well, I tell everybody, I said, a funeral home had more charm than this central building. There wasn't a thing on the wall. All right. So we started to put art on the wall, these canvas art prints. And then you say, okay. And then I had 4 women in the parish who had backgrounds in art, interior design. Oh, they were awesome. And then we'd start going through the catalogs or say, what do you think about, here's the Prodigal Son, here's Van Gogh's, the Good Samaritan, here's Botticelli's Mary, and here's one of the Crucifixion, here's a Caravaggio. And pretty soon people started to look around, and then they say, I want to buy one. Now the whole place is like a museum. But here's the thing that my insight is: somebody comes to a funeral luncheon, a loved one has died. They don't know what to say. They've got, these mixed feelings. They're grieving, and they see on the wall Botticelli's The Lamentation over the Dead Christ. Next thing you know, they're standing in front of it. And it allows them to grieve. It allows them to process. Or it's a conversation. We held a Chamber of Commerce function there. And right away, a number of people said, this is so cool. How do we book this facility? So I think it's something we have to pay attention to. Again, it's not only the inside of the church. It's any facility. Even our Catholic schools, what it's on the wall. What are the kids seeing? Imagine if you had a picture of the Sagrada Familia there. And kids will say, that's an interesting building. What is it? Again, we presume so much today where kids don't even know the stories of the gospel. And if you can depict them in art, the Calling of Matthew of Caravaggio, one of these masterpieces. I was at an alternative school in East LA as part of one of my experiments. And we got a grant, and it was a cultural grant. Well, one of the things we did was we took the students to the Getty Museum, and wanted to show them the Van Gogh irises. And I said, that's a $50 million painting. Keep in mind, this was almost 30 years ago. Who knows what it would go for today? And the kid's like, you're crazy, and then some of the other students who liked art, they would draw. They had never been exposed to different types. It's only what they saw in their neighborhood. And now you could just see the wheels turning in their head. It was incredible to expose people to that. And I myself am an experiential learner. When I travel, I have geographical knowledge, but firsthand it sticks with me. And there are a lot of people who learn that way. And I try to tell parents, taking a kid out of school for 2 weeks and taking him on some sort of learning field trip can be just as valuable as sitting in a classroom and looking at a book. In fact, there's something about standing in front of a painting. You think of Peter Paul Rubens. His paintings are 15 feet by 10 feet, and you're just overwhelmed by it. And you'll never forget that as long as you live. You might forget the name of a capital or, the year of some historical event, but when you see a painting and it's right there, you say, I will never forget that.
It's not a piece of sacred art, but I remember when I went to Amsterdam and the Van Gogh Museum. But one of my favorite pieces I saw in there was by Millet. And something that I had never considered before was that some of these paintings could be three-dimensional because of the amount of paint that was on it and the layers that they built up. You sat there and looked at it from different angles and you went, it moves. And so there is something to be said for being there. Like I could look at that same painting in a book and say, oh, that's pretty. Yeah. But to be there and see it, that experiential thing, you can't put it to words.
And light changes too. And again, that's great artists. You look at a church, stained glass is a great example. Morning light versus evening light. planning a pilgrimage to France in 26 called Gothic Grape and Gratitude. But we end up in Chartres, and have a day and a half there, because you go see the cathedral at night, and you see it in the morning, and it just changes your experience of it. It's just beautiful. It's incredible. But you're right, a really great artist will do that, where the different light starts to emphasize some of the different characters in the story. And all of a sudden you have this brand new insight. It's like, oh, I see what he was doing or she was doing. It's like, and you have this great aha moment. Yeah.
I'm about to ask you a stumper, Father.
All right.
In your travels, in the things you've experienced, what are your favorite pieces of art?
Oh, my goodness. Yeah. Bernini's Ecstasy of St. Teresa. No matter how many times I see it, I said, how did he create a sculpture that makes it look like she's floating in air? And he captures her diary, this just incredible human emotion, physical, and compared to the Pietà, which of course is still incredible, but it's behind glass. So you don't have that. It was meant to be able to walk around that. And then you go to the Borghese Museum and you see Bernini's David. Now, I like the Michelangelo David, but what I love about Bernini's is he's capturing David swinging that sling around, and you get this twisting and dirtling and the impression on his face, and you're brought into that story. And I think that is the key with some of the works of art that touch my heart, is I'm in the middle of that story. Like you said, Caravaggio's Madonna of Loreto, the incredulity of Thomas in the Vatican Museum, another Caravaggio, and I had an insight to that, and I've never seen a commentary on it, that I said, Jesus is not looking at his wound. I mean, at the side, pointing for Thomas to show there, which would be natural, he's looking at the wound on his hand. And as Thomas is incredulous about Jesus' wound, I think Jesus is incredulous to say, I did this for humanity. I would love to see people comment on that, but that's part of it. Sometimes I've seen some works of art that, like you said, a book can't do justice to it. You have to see it in person and walk around it. I put into a broader category when I say art, because it can be sculpture, it can be architecture, it can be sacred music. I was in Munich. 4 Jesuits were ordained the very next day in the Jesuit church. They have the Mozart Mass, and you're just like, wait a second, this is a glimpse of heaven, So it is kind of funny. You almost need time to sit there with a little cigar and bourbon and to say, what are the great places I've been to? Because it depends on the mood or what you're looking for, or even what surprises you. It's probably not until you don't have it anymore that you don't realize the appreciation of it. And I think the fire at Notre Dame was a great example. When the first time somebody said, did you hear about Notre Dame? And I thought, what, did they fire Coach Kelly or something? And they said, no, the cathedral. And then I saw it. It was just brought tears. And then they had the picture of the interior, which was all dark and black. And there's this gold cross that was way up in the choir, and it was lit. You talked about light, and it's like, there's hope. The church cannot be destroyed by darkness and fire. And what was the immediate response to the world? We are going to rebuild that. And it's going to be open this Christmas. And it's on my bucket list to go back to, because, again, that sense of you're in the presence of God's grandeur in a place like that nothing else can replace. I mean, I've rafted in the Zambezi River, and I've been to Disneyland and Disney World, and I've been to Super Bowl, and it's like, it doesn't compare. Yes, those are incredible moments, but it cannot compare with that sense of the sacredness and reverence and beauty, and community, all wrapped into one. I mean, I remember I was at Ash Wednesday Mass at Santa Sabina 1995 in Rome. John Paul II celebrated. And again, we're back to a 4th century church, pretty plain, all right? Well, so you're connected historically to the church, and then there's the Holy Father right there celebrating, Ash Wednesday Mass. And it was like, wow, I can't believe I'm here. You have to pinch yourself, to recognize that. But the long answer to your question is, it depends. What am I thinking of? What comes to mind? I'm going to have to start developing my top 50 or whatever. Sure. But that's actually kind of fun because that's what we're doing for one of these classes, the one here at St. Francis Xavier for the women's Bible study. We're using Jem Sullivan's Sacred Art Every Catholic Should Know. So she has her top 100 in there, I think, and it's like, yeah, obviously there's Bernini's in there, Ecstasy, there's Caravaggio's Calling of Matthew, and there's the Pietà, but then she has other ones. And so what these women are doing is, I said, develop your own corpus, your own canon to say, these are the works that I want to show to my grandchildren. These are the works that I want to see and visit. It depends on the experiences of your life, your own context, okay? But it is kind of fun because we'll discuss a work and then I'll show some others. So yesterday we were looking at paintings of the Annunciation. And our author, she chooses De Paolo's Annunciation, which is just a few years before Fra Angelico's. We're talking, mid-1400s or whatnot. And then I showed that. Then I showed Da Vinci's Annunciation. And then I showed them Henry Asawa Tanner's Annunciation, 1890s. It's in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And they went, wow, because here's an Annunciation they never thought of before. An actual young 15-year-old girl scared, waking up in the middle of the night like it's a nightmare. And I said, that's what the Annunciation would have been like. But it was kind of cool. And I said, well, the author chose her works for a particular reason. But now I'm exposing you to different paintings, different time periods, and then you can come, to say to yourself, if I was only going to choose 50 works of sacred art, what would I choose? Yeah. Because we also saw a video of a Ukrainian artist. Her last name is Demchuk. She wrote an icon of the Annunciation in 2020, right after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's incredible. But if you didn't understand the context, you wouldn't see what the artist is doing. She's bringing hope in the middle of war. It's beautiful. Yeah. But I think that's probably the message that I can give is have an encounter with it and then say, why does it attract me? What hits me in my life? So a work of art when you're a teenager may not hit you the same way when you're older and vice versa. Music can do the same thing. I try to play a piece of sacred music on these 2 classes that I'm doing, and music they've never heard of. It's like not only sacred art, every Catholic should know, but how many Catholics have heard, some of the classic pieces of like Charpentier's Te Deum, or Palestrina piece, but then I take them all the way up into the 21st century, Carl Jenkins, Ave Verum. And they said, that's gorgeous. And I said, have you ever heard it in church? Nobody raises their hand. So again, it's the same thing. We need to have great works of art accessible to the person in the pew. Great works of Catholic music, too. And then great works of architecture accessible to everybody. Because, that's what you're going to, I think, hold on to in times of challenge. You can go to a church, a quiet place, and be surrounded by beautiful music, the beauty of the church or the awesomeness of the architecture.
We've kind of been answering this question the whole time, but before we finish up, I want to ask it again so we can kind of bring everything together. How did art save the church?
You have the Counter-Reformation. You have a divided Europe on the cusp of war. So what you believe matters, okay? So the church took 2 shots, they were like, wow, boom, boom, 2 punches, and admittedly so, they needed to have some sort of change. There was corruption. Martin Luther was right in so many ways. But then when it got down to the theology, the real presence of the Eucharist, the mediation of the priest and the church in the sacraments, particularly reconciliation, the teachings of heaven and hell and purgatory, teachings of Mary, the intercessions of the saints, core beliefs of the church. People forget that for the first 1500s, it was one church. And these were core beliefs. They might have gotten pushed aside or, they got muddled and clouded. And now the church had to say, what do we believe in? It wasn't since the early councils that we had to articulate who's Jesus, the Trinity, even Mary's role. Well, now that all got muddled. And now the church is saying, okay, folks, we have to circle the wagons and articulate what do we believe. So you can produce these documents of Trent, which is great, nice. Well, how does even the priests convey that? Priests weren't educated. They didn't have the great seminary formation. Okay, so now they have to articulate that. It's like, call in the artists. So you had Charles Borromeo, who had the vision. And then you had the Jesuits, who were, had a sort of a separate vision about glorifying God and everything. St. Ignatius is saying, everything has a potential to eliciting a response of the divine. Okay, so and then you had great wealth. Some of these families, some of these cardinals, and they put it all together. The teaching, the inspiration. In Rome alone, in about a 50-year period, there were 50 new churches.
Wow.
Well, if you looked at the churches before, they had a screen. The faithful couldn't even see the Eucharist, couldn't see the elevation, didn't receive it. And now the very first church after the Council of Trent was the Jesu in Rome. You walk into it, and immediately your eyes are drawn to the altar, to the tabernacle. You say, that's the focus of the church. And then it would play it off of each other. And they did the same thing with articulating who Mary is. So now you're putting statues of Mary in church. You're having Marian feast days, Marian processions, all the rest. So they kind of worked hand in hand. But I love that idea. It saved the church because otherwise, the Protestants had the marketing, they had the printing press. Luther and some of the followers were putting out thousands of pamphlets about how bad the church was, the whore of Babylon, and all of a sudden the church had to say, okay, folks, we need to respond. So the Jesuits work at the top level. They're getting to these Bavarian princes, and trying to convince them. And then at the lower level, you have, the art that you can make accessible to the people. So now they can go to a church and look at a beautiful painting. I think the key thing is that get excited, online, Bishop Barron has a great podcast on how to evangelize with art, how to share your faith, but also bring others into it. So don't underestimate the impact that you can have by putting art in your own home. Putting the Last Supper in your dining room, putting something on your refrigerator, and then let people just experience it. Don't tell anything about it. And then let them say, well, what is it? Why do you have it there? Everybody has a role to play with. I can't draw a stick figure. I can't read a note. Okay, so it's not about talent and whatnot, but it's about that passion of the heart.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, Father, thank you so much for coming on to talk about this fascinating subject.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you for being with us today as we walk as pilgrims this road together. If you feel called to learn more, please consider checking out St. Francis Xavier or your local Catholic church. All are welcome into our community as God loves us all equally. If you are interested in supporting the Vox SFX podcast, please visit sfxmissoula.org/donate. Until next time, go forth in peace and be the light of Christ in someone's day.